speaker series on health, spirituality, and religion. We're excited that you're all here and very excited to be with our guest today, Rachel Aviv. Just a few announcements ahead of our conversation. We have a great year planned ahead with new humanism rounds for medical students and interesting speakers coming up, including Ruth Graham, a writer at the New York Times, Xavier Simmons from the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, and ethicist Asim Padel as well. Just a few announcements to get people up to speed with some of the things that we have going on here at Health, Spirituality, and Religion. We have a welcome dinner for medical students coming up Monday, September 11th at 6:30 p.m. Feel free to email Dr. Adam Baruch for more information, or check the email that was sent out with the information about this lecture. We really look forward to having interesting conversation, good food, and getting to know people and build some community together. The Conference on Medicine and Religion coming up, titled In Pursuit of the Great Coherence, Healing in Spaces Between. It's in April. If you're interested in presenting, we'd be happy to help you figure that out and would welcome any contact. We also have new student fellows for 23-24, Amanda Bahamond, Jill Byrne, and Basel Salka. They will be our HSR fellows, and we look forward to collaborating with them to build programs, have interesting conversations, and grow together. We have an elective branch for students coming up, April 8th to 21st. So if you are a branch student looking to explore the ways that spirituality and religion impact clinical care, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to give you more information. It's run by physicians and chaplains and from various departments, and it's been a good experience for those who participate in the past. Along with that, we have the ongoing ICU Chaplaincy Healing Presence Program. If you are doing an upcoming rotation in the ICU, we would love your participation in the Healing Presence Program. You have an opportunity to see the ICU through the lens of chaplaincy and develop some chaplaincy skills yourself and learn about ways that you can collaborate with them in clinical care. We're always open to student mentorship. If anyone has an idea that they'd like to discuss with us or a project they'd like to work on, we'll make sure to connect you with a mentorship opportunity and we'll see what we can do together. And just last but not least, there's coffee with HSR. So Dr. Adam Baruch and Dr. Kristen Collier are offering office hours for coffee and conversation. Talk about anything that's on your mind related to health, spirituality, and religion. Dr. Baruch will be meeting with students at Angelo's and Dr. Collier in her office. Those are the announcements. You can find all the information about that in the email that was sent with a link to this program. And I will now introduce Rachel Aviv, who we're really excited to have here today. Little background on her. Rachel Aviv is a staff writer at The New Yorker who has written for the magazine about a range of subjects, including medical ethics, psychiatry, criminal justice, and education. She was twice a finalist for the National Magazine Award for Public Interest, and in 2022, she won a National Magazine Award for profile writing. Her 2022 book, Strangers to Ourselves, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and named one of the 10 best books of 22 by the New York Times. We welcome Rachel virtually back to Michigan, where she grew up. And I believe even have your high school English teacher, Mr. Shaw, here on the call with us.
Are you serious? Where?
I don't know if he's here, but he said he was going to.
Oh my God.
You may see him soon. He's a friend of mine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Was he your was he your teacher? Is that how you know him?
I'm friends with his daughter, Alexa.
Alexa, yes.
Yeah. We connected about the book before we knew you'd be coming to join us today.
Alexa was like this person that everyone always looked up to. I looked up to her. She's a year older than me. Yeah.
I still look up to her too.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And personally, I'm excited to speak with you and meet you. I've always loved reading your articles. My wife's a psychologist. When we get to New York, we're always looking, does Rachel Aviv have something? There's something about the way that you write that is, I think, clarifying and resonant. So it's like you say the things that we see, but you say it in a way that allows us to see it clearly. So appreciate that about your writing. Personally, I'll kind of start with that.
Thanks.
Absolutely. So just to begin, I know you've spoken a lot about your book. I have it here. Unsettled Minds, Strangers to Ourselves. Put that out of order, but is there anything that's on your mind to share with us today as we get started? Some way you want to introduce this conversation?
No, only that like my dream would have been to be a doctor and then like approach this from that person. I mean, I'm glad that the doctors are, that the book is resonating with people like you guys. But no, I feel like I'll be better if you direct me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I know we're kind of structuring this as a conversation as much as possible. So you have a lot of doctors in the audience here, doctors in training. So if you have any questions and people want to, pipe up and share their own thoughts with Rachel, we would welcome that as well. That'd be very, very much welcome here. So maybe I'll start with some thoughts I had about the book, or lines that kind of stood out to me. I won't go into it's a fabulous book. Rachel tells her own story, tells the story of her good friend Chava, and tells the story of different people who she profiled. And each chapter is devoted to a different person. And there are these themes that are explored throughout about storytelling and diagnosis and illness, and what does that mean, and how it can be a social construct, but also a real thing that can be life-threatening. And it really kind of plays with your mind as you go through each of these chapters and read these about these different individuals. But I'll start with this line. You write, "I had just turned 6, and the boundaries between people felt porous." It stood out to me because you're so great at telling people stories. I read what you write and I say, I want to know a person like that. I want to be able to speak like that. What do you notice about that porousness and your ability to kind of hold the other, really feel what they're feeling, or see the world through their eyes?
That's interesting. I think, I mean, I guess I think two things. One is I do think as a child, you have this greater sense of like magical, it's not clear that like an individual is a bounded thing that you can't sort of merge into other people. So I think like even thinking about child psychology, like the very idea of an individual is a very different thing. Like when I think about being porous as an adult, I don't actually think I'm porous as an adult. I think in a way, the thing that maybe you are feeling like is porousness, but it's possibly something else, is that I often feel when I'm interviewing people that like the most sort of dumb way of putting it would be like, but for the grace of God go I. Kind of like if only like one or two different things in my life had been different, I can entirely see how I might be having these thoughts. Like people often, it never feels, and something I always try to make it clear with people I'm talking to is like, that makes sense. Like if I had been through those things, I would probably be thinking those thoughts too. So I never want someone to think the thoughts they're describing are like foreign or weird or sort of that I'm objectifying them. I want them to feel like I do often, which is like I could see how I might enter that state of mind. I think of porousness more. I mean, a question I get asked a lot that I always feel like I have a disappointing answer for is like, how do you respond to like the heaviness of people's stories, and like how do you sort of walk away from those encounters and not feel sort of like you've lost yourself? That I think of as porousness in a way, and I don't think I'm like that, like for better or for worse. I actually feel like there's some part of me that's able to be like, that was work. Like I'm stepping away and I'm sort of like I remember interviewing a 14-year-old boy who was in prison. His sentence was life without parole. And I would go to the prison in Michigan like once a week and talk to him for like 3 or 4 hours. And it's not like a generous thing to say, but like the drives home from the prison were just like ecstatic experiences. Like I was like, I can return to myself. So I do think like I have some boundaries in terms of identification on one level, but on another level, I often feel like I'm never looking at someone like what they're saying is like foreign or ununderstandable.
Yeah, you're able to inhabit the world through their eyes, non-judgmentally, with empathy and presence, and then return to yourself after.
Yeah. I think I've thought a lot about, there's this amazing essay in the New York Review of Books called The Banality of Empathy.
Mhm.
And I haven't read it in a while. Oh, did you? Oh, sorry. Oh, it's fine. You're the speaker and it moved away.
Oh, okay. All right.
I think, and I have a friend actually whose daughter has a very severe disability. And she always said, like, she didn't understand why the conversation in medicine and literature is often on that word empathy, that like,
Mhm.
that there was something that felt like cloying about the word, that like compassion is the better word. And I think that's something that I've thought about and want to think about more. Like, what is it that we say we're doing when we're empathizing with someone?
Yeah, it is a good question. Like, what is the difference between presence in someone
Mhm.
else's experience and empathy for them? I could,
Right, right. Like, are we creating a false, is empathy sort of leveling things in a false way, whereas compassion is like, here I am, a separate person giving you like love and care, but from a very different perspective, and I can't pretend to know your perspective. I don't know. It's like a thought process that I've been having.
yeah. Well, what is it about the word empathy that kind of rubs you the wrong way or
It
rubs the
I
essay?
actually feel like I need my friend here to
Okay.
discuss it. She always found it
Mhm.
like people patting themselves on the back and like,
Mhm.
you're so empathetic. Like, and what does that do for the other person? Like, is that doing anything for the other person to sort of empathize? Like, is there something that would sort of bring you to action more than empathy?
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good question. If the goal is to action, well, I think
Yeah.
what's great about your stories is uh, I think I would I think I would probably use the word empathy.
It's okay. I don't have like a
Because I think you really get into the feeling of the person, but I think there's something more than that. I think there's something about like a non-judgmental kind of respectfulness and
Mhm,
openness to
mhm.
the world of another person and recognizing it's actually the world of another person.
Yeah.
Like there's almost
Yeah.
this, I don't know, I don't want to speak for you about your story, but when I read it, there's this suspension of belief. Like it's not about me and my story. I'm
Mhm.
entering your world with you and trying to understand it from the inside. And I don't, it almost
I
leaves.
like that way of putting it. And I think that is like not the non-judgmental aspect. And
Yeah.
I find
Right.
that really interesting with mental illness in particular, because people are so used to being judged and so used
Mm-hmm.
to hiding things like as a protective fear of being judged,
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
to prevent against that dreaded outcome of being judged.
Yeah. Yep. Right. Right. I don't think you are kind of telling these like pity stories or compassion stories. I think you're telling
Mhm.
stories and they're
Yeah.
powerful. I would say
Yeah.
is the reader, it brings up a lot of feeling. Like you're not, it's not just factual. It's like you read
Right.
about these people and their lives and the way they experience the world, and it's, I don't know, it's touching. So I don't know what you would
It
call
is
that
like
feeling, not
interesting how
empathy.
many people, not everyone felt like they had a story to tell, but a lot of people who have gone through an illness experience do feel that way. And so, like, one
Mm.
of the, there were people I approached that I wanted to write chapters about who didn't want that attention and didn't want to like delve into that experience.
Yeah.
Um, but all the people I wrote about like did feel like they had the one of the ways that they were dealing with like the grief of the years that they lost to mental illness was through the sense of like, I can help other people feel less alone
Mm.
and less alienated by sharing my story.
Sure. Absolutely. And it's, as we talk about this, I'll maybe read another passage from the book. And just to highlight, I think maybe as a writer, you're so used to telling stories
Mhm.
and going there with people and really with an immense curiosity and really being able to give voice to someone else. But I'll read some notes here from your own medical records that
Mhm.
you shared in your book. You write, my medical records do not present a coherent picture of why I wasn't eating or drinking. One psychologist wrote, clearly her symptoms are an expression of the pathology in the relationship between her mother and father. Another observed, Rachel attempts to look inside herself to understand and resolve her intense feelings related to her external world, but struggles with an overcomplicated thought process, leading to a self-condemning attitude, i.e., I must be the problem. It's dense clinical language. I recognize it from my own documentation. And it's the way that we in medicine, right? We take a story, we take a person, and even someone who's listening to stories gets processed in language that's abstract. I almost don't see you in this writing in the way that I see you in the way that you write about yourself and tell your story. And I'm curious about this, the different ways that we even write about this, the way that things are documented in a chart versus the storytelling you do as a journalist and a writer.
I mean, it's interesting because I actually came away with reading my evaluations, and this was from 1988, and like we had good health insurance. I had like some respect for these doctors. I thought that both of those sentences are like true. They just miss a lot of other things. But like I thought that I was sort of like, oh, this is an elegant statement of like one perspective of seeing this issue. I mean, I think with my own experiences, and I don't know, should I like fill people in or will they?
Sure. Yeah, please feel free. Some people have read, some people haven't.
So the experience of like, I was a 6-year-old and I had stopped eating, and it sort of quickly got diagnosed as childhood anorexia. And I was put in a hospital with these older girls. And once I was in the hospital, it was almost like I learned what it was to be anorexic, because that was not a word I knew. And the other girls, like, in a sense, taught me how to do these things, which I then inhabited this diagnosis more. So of course, the doctor's notes are looking at my family life, which I think is good and real and sort of relevant. But no one is thinking about like, how is the very fact that we have diagnosed this child with anorexia sort of affecting her own psyche and affecting her, the way her family treats her and her community treats her and her sense of her role at school and all these other things. So there's this sort of like level of thinking about diagnosis as this like neutral mirror of someone's condition, and not thinking about what happens when someone looks in that mirror and it sort of changes their self-perception. And I think like that level of analysis was not in the records. And that felt, given how young I was and like how porous I was, a significant piece of it.
Yeah.
But then like thinking about someone like Naomi, who I write about in the book, and she was a young Black mother with 4 kids, and she ended up having this like extreme episode of postpartum psychosis, and she dropped her twins off a bridge and one died. And so then she was put into the criminal justice system. And like that was an example where the medical language just could not capture her experience, because it seemed to always be either, she would make a lot of statements to the doctors about how like you can't grow up as a brown or Black person in this world and not feel like your life meant nothing. And so some doctors would say, wait, this person is like sane. Like that's a real sociological insight about what it's like to be a Black person in America. And then some doctors would be like, so in some way she didn't get the treatment she like deserved, because she was sort of making these criticisms of like social life that felt like true. I don't know, that was this confusing dynamic where she like wasn't treated as insane because she was saying like real things, but there wasn't an appreciation for the like dynamic of like delusions having some core of truth, but that like sort of, I don't know, I think that's a really hard thing to deal with as a psychiatrist. Like someone is telling you something very true, but it has like entered a level of enormity that is delusional, like that dynamic. And I think in brief notes, like that problem is not like addressed.
Yeah.
And I felt like I could write about it in a way that took into account like history, which was part of her experience, in a way that like the doctors couldn't.
Sure. I think it's a problem of documentation that reflects a problem of conceptualization. You're trying to think diagnostically and see what symptoms the person have and what diagnosis do they fit in. The information that's not are not pertinent positives that you want to document and attend to. Now let's let it pass by. But what you're highlighting is that might be a big part of the story, the primary part of the story that gets missed. I mean, my mentor, Dr. Sugar, just messaged it's like a way of premature closure as well. is kind of closing, up with this type of documentation, or saying, I have a handle on the situation. I grasp it. I'm able to use this clinical language to have ownership over this person and what they're going through. But so much gets lost in that process that I think you really bring to light in your own writing.
I think and there's another story about Laura, who's sort of like the opposite sort of patient as Naomi. She's like very wealthy, white, this pretty Greenwich, Connecticut girl. And like the doctors, I think, I don't know how premature closure would apply, but it was like they were searching her family's history for something that would explain. I mean, there was like more curiosity about her for sure. But then I think there was also a sense of like, her life has been so good by all these metrics that therefore we can only assume it's a chemical problem. So like, because what else is there? And so she was sort of like over-treated, over-medicalized, because her doctors were like so desperate to help her somehow.
Yeah. That was a really difficult story to read as a psychiatrist.
Yeah. I have a friend who is a doctor, Rikers, the jail, New York, and like she was just so angry. Like she was just like, this patient is like, she felt like the doctors were identifying with her too much in a way, and she was sort of like, I don't know. There's a lot to be said about that dynamic. It like, she felt like it was sort of a co-created dynamic. Like it wasn't just the doctor's fault. It was the patient sort of kind of participating in this like attention cycle.
Yeah. Definitely want to come to that. The social factors in like the identification with the diagnosis or a disease process. Just want to kind of jump onto another topic here.
Jeremy, can we grab Victoria's question?
Oh, of course. Yes, Victoria, please. Questions. Hi.
Yeah. So I guess this question is a little personal. So I guess I wanted to start off with that it's personal to me also. I was really touched by you exploring your own relationship with psychiatry, and specifically with psychiatric medications. And I thought one thing that became obvious when you talked about these like online support groups of helping people taper off medications, that is pretty clearly a gap within the field of psychiatry, that we're helping people get on these meds, but not supporting them fully in getting off. But yeah, I'm going through a similar experience in my own life right now and trying to figure out what the balance is between having like the short-term benefits of a psychiatric medication contrasted with the long-term side effects, and some of the evidence that shows that people who end up on these medications actually have like worse overall prognoses. But with all that being said, I was just wondering if you would be willing to just kind of touch on how your relationship with that topic personally has evolved since you published the book.
Sadly, I don't know that it's evolved very much. Like I think the way it's evolved is I was like, I just can't like, I think it's hard to know because it feels like self-justifying, like there's a part of me that is like, these medications work. Like, what is and I've already had my children. I'm not going to have babies anymore. Like that was a real concern, is like being on medications while I was pregnant. So that phase of my life has ended. And I think like, I remember this word, like, what is it? Pharmaceutical puritanism or something, like this sort of ideal that to be off the medications is a moral good, like that there is something just sort of good and pure and right about being off medications if you can be off medications. And I think I've tried to like interrogate that idea in terms of myself, but it could be self-justifying because I'm like, I don't want to go off this. Like it helps me. I haven't really engaged in like some deep research about like what it would mean to be on Lexapro for my entire life. I've sort of been like, I think I remember talking to a couples therapist once, and I was like, yeah, I think I can make my husband's downstairs, so I shouldn't say this too loud, but I was like, I think I can make my marriage work like as long as I stay on Lexapro. And she was like, why do you do it? Like, I don't know. It's like, it's a confusing thing because it's not a medical question at some point. It's like existential. It feels like very cultural. It feels like you're sort of trying to figure out what you prioritize in life. And so in that sense, like I can understand why a doctor like wouldn't be the right person to talk about that with. But I do feel like there should be more knowledge, and I don't even feel like I have that knowledge of like, what are the risks? Like, what is the risk of staying on Lexapro for decades and decades? I just don't feel like I have a clear handle on that.
Yeah, totally. I think it's really interesting, the pharmaceutical puritanism that you just brought up, because I definitely see that reflected in my own thought process. And at the same time, contrasting that with this idea, especially when you're immersed in like the medical field and around a lot of people with this understanding that like a pharmaceutical is how you can correct this so-called imbalance, that it seems like, you know, being on the medications is then like the responsible thing to do. So this contrast between like, it's responsible to stay on it so that I'm like even keeled, but then also this allure of being able to be like pure without anything. So
right.
Yeah, just thoughts.
I mean, it was interesting, you know, I did look at the literature of like staying on Lexapro through pregnancy versus not. And, you know, one of the things I found so tragic was some of those studies of like people who had gone off medications for the benefit of their baby had then ended up being like, I can't have a baby. I can't do this. I'm going to abort the baby. And so like that just like, and I felt like there wasn't a sufficient acknowledgement of like, yeah, it's just a hard, it's clear the cost benefit when you're dealing with pregnancy, because it's like, what happens when an anxious mother has a baby? Like, is the baby affected by that versus what happens when a mother is not anxious but is on this drug? I don't know. I feel like it's like with the amount of people that are taking these medications and sort of treating them almost like they're not medications, like they're just some sort of like life assistance. It is confusing that there's not like more known about that.
Yeah, thank you for writing about that. I think a lot of people are going through this thought process and also are in a similar place of you, where just like mine isn't made up.
Like, the sexuality component of SSRIs, I was like, and I remember talking to people then, they're like, why has no one written about the sexual side effects of SSRIs in like a real way? Like that feels like a cultural phenomenon. Like all these people saying like, it's okay. I don't care if I lose my like fundamental sex drive, like fine. Like that just is like an interesting sort of valuing of what's important in life.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting how right after that you said that it almost fits in more with the gender constructs that like, and it's like okay that women in particular are like losing some of their sex drive.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you for your question, Victoria. Appreciate it. So given that this is a program in health, spirituality, and religion, I thought I would read to you some things you wrote on that topic a little bit. You wrote, how about this is your friend who had anorexia, may also have been unduly influenced by the spirit of Yom Kippur, which you said had influenced you as well. She went to a Jewish day school and was terrified, she wrote in her journal, that she would not be written in the book of life, God's record of those who deserve to live another year. She blamed herself for not achieving a state of holy perfection. And later on, you write about this in a Christian context. Several scholars have studied the parallels between anorexia nervosa and anorexia mirabilis, a condition in the Middle Ages in which young religious women starved themselves as a way of freeing their spirits from their bodies and becoming one with the suffering of Christ. Their loss of appetite, it was said, was a miracle. Their bodies became such powerful symbols of faith and purity that they struggled to begin eating again, even when their lives were at risk. So we were able to offer your books to students to read ahead of this conversation, and some of them responded with some questions, and a lot of them did have questions about related to questions of spirituality. How do you kind of think of it its own thing? How do you think of it in ways that it may be kind of a guise for pathological behavior? What emerges in the absence of spiritual practice? How are these fundamental impulses that get expressed in kind of non-religious settings, just as they were, in a world where religion was a dominant mode of self-expression. Any thoughts or reactions you have about that?
I mean, it was interesting to write about Bapu, who is this woman living in India, in Chennai in the 70s. And had she been living in America today, or even in the 70s, she would have, her sort of sense of connection to the divine would have been dismissed offhand as schizophrenia. But in Chennai, like there was sort of a cultural space to really celebrate like this actual gift she had. Like it wasn't just that she thought she was connected to God, it was that she was writing this incredible poetry that really seemed to come from nowhere and was like recognized by scholars as incredibly gifted. And I think that I had written my first story for the New Yorker was about this woman named Linda Bishop who like escaped from a psychiatric hospital, moved into this cottage and just survived on apples from an apple tree. And she also felt connected to God, but no one even for a second kind of gave that credit, even though there was like real logic to her feeling like, I just want to live alone in the country, sort of connected with God. Like there was something there that like one can understand. But I think it was interesting to write that story and then to focus on Bapu and to see that like she actually like got this tremendous amount of self-confidence from being in an environment. Like she would run away to healing temples, and in these healing temples there was space for women like her who were sort of feeling this divine connection and connecting with each other over this divine connection. And it just felt very confusing because like she had 2 children and her son felt like she had lived this like completely spiritual life. And her daughter felt like she had also lived this completely spiritual life, but to deny the fact that she had this like profound disability was a sort of undermining of who her mother was. Like that there's a level in which like if you celebrate someone's sort of like spiritual prowess without looking at the fact that like they're hungry and they have like sores on their body and they have nowhere to sleep, that there's like a false kind of glorification. And I think it's like really hard to figure out how to, and I think Bapu's family did sort of at the end, like they could respect her sort of poetic and divine gifts while also being able to say like, this medication will allow you to like think and write better, as opposed to like, this medication will cure this thing you have called schizophrenia. Like they didn't need to diagnose her to sort of convince her that there was benefit from taking medications. I think like the anorexia question is really interesting in part because I'm writing a profile of Joyce Carol Oates, who also has Michigan connections. And she has like 5,000 pages of journals, and I've been reading them. And there's this sort of thread in her journals of like fasting, and sort of not being quite thin and like quite sort of deprived of nutrition, but feeling like exalted, sort of feeling like she could like think and sort of be this exalted version of herself. And I think it's interesting, like anorexia really became known as the like media disease, like the disease where you want to be thin because you want to look good. And like that there's this other component that even if it's not spiritual today, there is some sense of like accessing some higher being that probably like it would be useful to acknowledge that there is that like euphoric feeling more.
Yeah, it's interesting as you share that, because that's something that's not really explored when it comes to psychiatry. I think with Bapu, you felt this with the psychiatrist who you had interviewed where the records from, and there was this kind of antipathy towards her religious experience, and they're misunderstood, and this person's sick, and it's clearly schizophrenia, and it was kind of dismissed whole scale, rather than kind of this curiosity of what's this like for her from the inside.
Right. Like what does it feel like not to eat for all these days? Like what is that giving her? And like, if she's forced not to, what will she be missing? And sort of, is there a way of like creating that thing she's missing while still making her healthy enough to eat. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I see someone with a
we have a
hand.
question from Ellie.
Yeah, thank you. Just as you were talking, I was sort of piecing together sort of parallels between Laura and Hava and the role of expectation while a young person is developing their identity, whether it's like a religious ideal to aspire to, or in the case of Laura, because she was athletically gifted and academically gifted, there was this perfect ideal that she was sort of established. This, she said it felt like she was living a stranger's life. And so I was just wondering, from your perspective and talking to people, like, what do you think is the role of these different sources of expectation? Like, because the fact that she has everything that you might want in life is maybe the source of the problem, like having these really high expectations while you're still trying to figure out who you are. Like, you have this prescribed identity before you really get a sense to even know yourself. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Wait, it's like, I mean, I felt with Laura that she didn't have tolerance for disappointment or friction. And maybe that was like something that had been taught, or maybe that was something within her, but like the sort of lack of tolerance for just like so that someone had told her that life doesn't need to be messy or something. And then when it was messy, it just like felt explosive and catastrophic. But something else that I thought of when you were asking that question is, I remember I gave the Bapu chapter to a friend who's an anthropologist and who has written a lot about spirituality. And he was like, you need to be careful that you're not treating, he was like, the idea that Bapu is a mystic functioned for her in a way that was quite similar to the idea that like Laura was bipolar. Like, even if it's not a diagnosis, it's still this sort of label and identity that Bapu then, that sort of shaped her behavior, both for better and for worse. Like, she felt like she was a mystic, therefore it kind of circumscribed her life in certain ways and became its own kind of like looping effect. So I think, like, even though I was focusing on diagnoses, it's not as if identifying as some sort of like spiritual leader is not also its own like self-fulfilling prophecy that can be liberating maybe, but also like problematic and constraining in its own way.
Yeah.
Did that answer the question?
Ellie, did you feel?
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Yes, it's complicated. I mean, this one of the students submitted this question. Maybe I'll ask it now, which was, there are all these conceptualizations, and each one has its limitation. This biological, chemical interpretation, it was promised to be the solution and has all its limitations. There's biopsychosocial model that we learn in medical school, kind of looking at people through these different lenses, which has limitations. Psychoanalytic model that has its limitations. They all kind of offer some value, but then you can critique it as well. Where does this leave us? And from your work and thinking, like, how might one try to think about a person when hearing their story and trying to be helpful to them in a medical setting, attending to questions of distress?
I mean, I think the acknowledgement of the limitations is like goes a huge way, and the sense, even going back to like my childhood experience, like, yes, it was a response to like the pathology between my parents, but sort of to assume that that's the whole story, to assume that like these explanatory systems are like cover it all, and that sometimes like more than one explanation is right. I think that felt like the thing that so often happens is that there's like a lack of humility. Like, you feel like you have the explanation and it's sort of the only explanation, as opposed to like multiple, like not mutually exclusive, interlocking ways of seeing the problem. And like, I think also like realizing that there might be one way of seeing the problem that feels more healing to the patient, like the spiritual way, and that like there's ways of entering into that spiritual way of seeing it without making that person feel like that worldview is threatened somehow by the treatment. I think that like Bapu really felt like it was threatened, and that like these two things were at odds.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like the human mind and experience is a Pandora's box, and we need a Pandora's box of thinking to relate to it and kind of be there with it. Yeah. So one other kind of question I want to ask, and then we'll open up to everyone else, is I'll read a couple parts of that you wrote, and feel free to think about in terms of you or in terms of some of the people you write about in the book. You write about your experience in the hospital with anorexia. My parents were angry that it had fallen under the sway of older girls versed in the illness. Until then, it had been pure mental process. It was so internal to you, my stepmom told me, and in contrast to what emerged. And you write about, we find a way to express our distress through imitation until eventually we have learned, or better, acquired a new psychic state. And then one more quote here is, there are stories that save us and stories that trap us. And in the midst of an illness, it can be very hard to know which is which. Kind of the sensitivity to the social elements of illness, of diagnosis, of how we come to know ourselves. And then, to contrast with your friendship with Hava, who dies from her anorexia, which is a really painful way that you close the book. And it really hits home that it's social and it's in our bodies, and it's life-threatening and it's relational, and it's this play back and forth is really powerful in all of these stories that you share. Just curious what comes up for you as I read those parts back.
I mean, I do remember going and learning about Hava, and I'd already written a lot of the book when I learned that she had died. And I felt like personally sort of ashamed of myself. Like I was like, it was chastening because I was like, there is this beauty to seeing illness as cultural construction. And it's very seductive because that's great. Then like, it's easy, if we can like the sort of anti-psychiatry ideas from the 70s, where they were like proposing this very beautiful vision of a world in which like it's the world that's insane and the people are responding to it. But I think I really felt like I had to acknowledge the deep limits of that perspective. The fact that like there's just like a cold hard truth to and like there is the sense I always had that Hava and I were very similar, and that like we could have but I don't know, but it's just so it felt to me like mostly just chastening. Like no matter how hard you try to like find a sort of explanatory system, like one is never going to be enough. And also like the sense of momentum, like Hava had kind of devoted her whole life to being anorexic, and like years and years of that changes your body. So it wasn't just that like what I had at age 6 and what she had at age 12 might have been different. It was that like she then had like decades of this behavior that changed her body and changed her mind.
Sure.
But I think like the original quotes you read did come from this space of like, I think like what structured the book was this like sense of confusion I had when I was reporting a story in Sweden about these young children who had been denied asylum in Sweden and then like took to their beds and stopped eating and stopped moving. And it was so hard to understand their behavior. And yet I like really felt a strong sense of connection between the like anorexic behavior I'd showed in a completely different cultural and political context. And I just felt like, what is the commonality, and like, can we figure out like, can it be said that a person has some sort of like core essence of an illness and sort of like of or is it always expressed in a way that is like shaped by expectations and culture and conditions? Like that to me felt like, I guess, the central question that like no one can ever answer, but like what is it that when you strip away everything, like what's the heart of that illness? I think like for something like bipolar, it's maybe easier to answer than something like anorexia.
Sure. Yeah. I love how you play this out in your book.
Thanks.
Beautiful. They're both true. And you're just like, wow, this is complicated. But I think that's what your book brings to the fore. Like, this is complicated. So let's like slow down, think openly, be patient, give time, give space. I really can tell I love your book.
Yeah.
If I were teaching like how to interview and how to this is the text I would use. I mean, it's really striking. And I'll share words of I know you feel like there's a part of you that maybe wants to be a doctor and the side of this medical side of things. But I can't find the quote from the student here. I'm sorry, but he wrote something very nice, like about how like he feels just reading this as a first year medical student is really going to shape the way that he goes through his education and hears people and recognizing what he doesn't know and what to stay curious about. So it was really
that makes it worth like
you're having that impact. Absolutely. I want to open up to questions from the audience as well. I know, thank you to those who have asked, but questions and comments from anyone else, people who've read the book, people who heard something that ignited their interest. You're all welcome to either raise your hand or unmute yourself and start talking. Ideally one at a time.
Hey, Rachel, thank you so much for being here. I loved your idea about the mirror that we put up and that at some point it reflects back. I think that you wrote about mental health. As an OBGYN, I'm in a space that sometimes deals with mental health and sometimes doesn't. But I think that you kind of focused on the tip of the spear with a lot of this stuff, the way that identity impact or diagnosis impacts identity and society and societal roles impact both of those and the interwovenness of all that. I'm just thinking about sometimes as an OB, I'll be in a situation where the baby's heart rate is concerning when someone's in labor. And so we recommend a C-section. And so it's not really a moral decision. It's kind of like an analytical decision. Like I'm worried about your baby's brain. And so I think we should have a C-section, for example.
Yeah.
And then 6 weeks later, when I see that same mom back in clinic, she's reflecting on questions of identity. What does this mean about me? Can I have a vaginal birth? The way that our kind of reductionist biological approach to healthcare, not just in mental health, taps into people's identities. And sometimes we are attuned to it and sometimes we're not attuned to it. And sometimes maybe we shouldn't be attuned to it. Like someone comes in with burning when they pee and it's like, you might have a UTI. We probably shouldn't dive into like what this means about you. In other areas, mental health, disability, pain, where there's this huge psychosocial component where I think one of my reflections is maybe patients, like people come in to see us expecting us to be able to navigate that with them. And perhaps we should have like, okay, now that you're done speaking with me as a doctor, here's a journalist who can help you unpack kind of the meaning behind it. I don't know. It's like,
it's really interesting that you give that example because I kind of, follow what Laura does now. And after like the next book she wants to write, she's going to work on a memoir about like her own sort of rejection of psychiatry. And then she ended up, I think, having 2 kids. And now her sort of mission relates to like natural births. And I was like, it almost kind of like took away from my understanding of her thoughts about psychiatry. Because I was like, oh, this is sort of a fitting into this other framework, which, I mean, I find the kind of I think that is interesting. Like people have the sense of their identity needing to be pure of medicine, and we're like living in 2023, but like to have a C-section feels like some incursion on their sense of self. I don't know. I haven't thought much about that, but I've always been confused because it feels more dangerous. So I'm like, well, so what are you giving up in terms of your own sense of who you are by taking those risks? And I felt like somehow Laura bridging those was making me understand something also about the sort of, I think sometimes like fetishization of like what is like natural and whether that is earned or not. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any students who would like to ask a question? I just want to open it up first directly to students and see if anyone wants to jump in with a question or comment. And
I have another
oh, please go ahead.
if that's okay. Journaling seems so central to being able to understand people and their histories. And I was just wondering, how do you think the stories are shaped by the fact that these are individuals who, you know, record their lives like this? Like, there are many mentally ill people who don't have that sense of narrative structure to their life. And so what role do you think that plays in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely wrote about people who felt that there was a story within them, that they were already, I mean, I think there's different ways of thinking about it. Like, on the one hand, I wanted to write about people who journaled, not, it didn't need to be a journal, but like people who sort of documented their experiences at various phases in the illness, because I do think that, like, as you get more distance from like a experience of psychic distress, you sort of like settle on an interpretation of it. And it was interesting for me to see, like, as I got closer to the event, the things they were saying about the experience would be very different from what they told me in a conversation years later. So for me, it was to some degree like how to capture the original experience and the way that it changed with like expert interpretations. But yeah, no, it's not like I chose, I can't say that the people I chose are like a scientific sample of people with mental illness, because I did choose people who like had a desire to write their stories. But I do think that, like, they also had a sense that like words were inadequate to their stories. And I think that that was part of the motivation in trying to articulate it. And I feel like that's probably more common. Like, not everyone writes it down, but I think that experience of being like, I cannot translate this experience into words, does feel really common, and does feel like excruciating in its own way to like have had this experience and not be able to like share it with someone or communicate it, and to feel like it's unspeakable somehow.
I want to get to Rennie and Hannah's question, but if I could jump in just a quick response about what was it like for people to read their stories, to hear their stories told in such a full way. What was say about that?
Like, I think for, you know, Bapu's family was the one whose response was most gratifying. I feel like they like donated the book to this like special library in India where the Bapu had loved. Like, they felt like it was sort of a family history preserved. I don't know what, like, Laura never actually gave me her actual, like, she just sort of like wrote warm thank yous for sending her things without like engaging with what I'd actually said.
Okay.
I think for the people who had died, it felt like sort of preserving a way of like, yeah, but I'm trying to think. Oh, Naomi, you know, like, you never know. Naomi said it's great, but like but this one detail I just want you to change. Like, it's just hard to say what they truly felt.
Sure. Everyone was different.
Yeah.
I just want to come to Rennie and Dev. You guys were up next, then Hannah. We'll get you in, and then before we end.
Thanks. We've touched on it a little bit, but I think there's sort of, in some ways, I guess, like a little bit of conflict between the concept of labels and sort of these stories that can help us or trap us, and then this concept of insight, which I think you bring up a lot, especially in Naomi's story too. And I guess in what ways, like in insight, right, if like the patient needs to sort of come to terms and understand this diagnosis, and I think sometimes when you're placing a label or a diagnosis on a patient, that can be a very rewarding experience, even outside of psychiatric illnesses, where, you know, maybe that's an entry point to form a community, even if the diagnosis does not feel totally perfect. And sometimes, you know, it is spot on. That's what you have, you know, we identified a gene or whatever it is. And then I think other times maybe it feels like, oh, that's just, it doesn't fit. And like maybe that interferes with the patient's ability to sort of have greater insight to their own diagnosis. And I don't know, just sort of where that tension lies, and also like who gets to decide exactly how a patient has insight. And I feel like it's often used as sort of this barometer of their ability to heal and to kind of progress into like a normal. So
I mean, I feel like you just said all the things I might say. Like, that was a really good way of describing it. I like, one of the things that I found most interesting was this expectation that when people talk about their illnesses in a certain way, it reduces stigma. Like that this sort of like nationwide effort to talk about mental illness as a brain disease, and that this will reduce stigma. And I found it very like, I don't know what to do with the sense of surprise, but that like, even this thing that we think will reduce stigma, like, no, it doesn't actually, because there's the other sense of like, if it's in your biology, then you feel like you don't have a sense of control over it. You feel like it's sort of this thing that you're going to live with forever. And it feels like insight is one of those same things, like you just cannot predict how someone will respond, like whether knowing their diagnosis will be really empowering at first, and like it will change over the course of their lifetime. So I guess I generally felt like we have all these sort of presumptions baked into the idea of insight, and like sometimes they're true and sometimes they're just not, and it's like really hard to figure that out.
Great question. Thanks for your response. It speaks to me. And Hannah, love to hear from you too.
Hi there. I will open by saying that I haven't read your book yet. So if you have already addressed it, I want to emphasize yet, I do plan on reading it. But I am curious if, like, over the time that you were interviewing folks for your research, how and if you noticed folks' like relationship with healthcare change, given the like political climate and sort of how trust plays a role. And I think that we've seen that like maybe play out more in non-mental health spaces, but I'm curious if that sort of discord had also maybe like evolved in some of these patients' relationships. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the only person it really was relevant for was Naomi, in terms of like their thoughts changing over the course of the reporting. And I think she just felt like there was a greater sort of more language to describe the sense of mistrust that she had felt for doctors and for psychiatrists. I felt like she felt a little more emboldened, like she could place her sense of mistrust in a larger context that wasn't as like readily available. Or, you know, she could just say George Floyd, and it's like she felt like someone understood something that they previously hadn't. So I think that helped her feel like she'd been right in a way that like she hadn't even understood she'd been right before. Does that make sense? I think for the others, it probably wasn't as relevant, and it's maybe like because my timeline, I guess I finished reporting by like spring 2021. So yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yes. I'll second the thanks. Thank you, Rachel, for being here with us. Thank you for everyone for joining. We look forward to seeing you at other opportunities this year to learn together with HSR at these speaker series and other events. And you can tell there's a lot of excitement about your book here amongst the people who read it, the people who are curious to learn more. Thank you for what you do. Seriously.
Yeah, thank you guys for such great questions. It's like actually really fun to answer questions for medical students who are like engaged with this in a really day-to-day way. So yeah, it's nice to talk.
Thank you.
Can I just ask really quickly if we could get your contact information if we want to continue the conversation, but it's totally fine if
it's easy. It's just rachel.aviv@gmail.com.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Have a
Bye.
good day. Bye.